And that's going to spill over to Europe as well, and to Germany. Remember Russian mafia, you had it.
We have a lot of them.
Multiply that by 10. That's what's coming to Germany and to every country, not just Germany, because Russia is going to be exporting mafia. There's so much of it will be in Russia, there won't be enough space for it inside the country. And I think the Germans should be much, much more afraid of that.
Hello everybody, I'm once again really happy to speak with Konstantin. His fantastic YouTube channel is called Inside Russia, and it is linked down below. Konstantin is an unusual Russian. He is explaining Russia to everyone in the world who wants to hear the truth and who wants to dig deeper. He can explain Russia so that the madness makes sense. Of course, he's living outside of Russia because he had to flee from there in the year 2022. Otherwise, he would be for sure in prison or even worse. But now in his exile, he's also threatened by the Russian Secret Service, FSB, and that must be a horrible feeling. We've been talking about that in our last episode. Howdy, Konstantin. How are you doing?
Howdy, Christoph. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine too, and it's not so hot anymore here in Germany. Let me also quickly introduce myself. My name is Christoph Müller. I live in Germany. I am a musician and I have this YouTube channel, Talk for Ukraine. Recently I started a purely German channel, Talk for Ukraine Deutsch, so please make sure to also subscribe to the new channel. Let me start with a quote. The pitcher goes so often to the well until it breaks. Why do I quote this? Konstantin, you said there is a deal in Russia, and it has always been this deal between ruler and population. And this deal is getting heavy cracks now. Can you please explain the agreement between Tsar and people in Russia?
It's not a recent occurrence, development. Okay, Russia has lived under this deal for not even decades, for centuries. Basically, the deal is very simple. We provide you a decent life, good life perhaps, and you stay out of politics. You don't ask questions who rules Russia. Why? Because that question has already been answered. That is the social deal that I was born into in the USSR, not by choice. We were forced to live in this deal. And when the USSR fell apart, for about 10 years, we were breathing freely. It was very good, intoxicating feeling. Although the 90s were really hard financially because of the transformation from one economic model to another one. But it's got to get done. You can't just jump from socialism, communism to capitalism, and you can't turn your life from terrible to great, overnight. So, but Russians did a very good job. It took them 10 years, and those 10 years were fairly free. And then Vladimir Putin came, and he sold Russians another deal. Same deal, only after a little different sauce. You see, when Putin came into power in 1990, I'm just going to give you one number. When Putin came to power on the first day of 2000, the price of oil was $24, around $24 per barrel. When Putin, it was his last year, 2008, the price on the 1st of January, so 8 years later, for the 1st of January of 2008, the price of oil was $97 per barrel. And Russia got majority of its money from selling natural gas and oil. So therefore, Vladimir Putin, he was just lucky to have all this huge money fell on him.
Yeah.
And he started using this money to enforce this deal. And Russians, obviously, they started living a very good life. That was the best time in lives of Russians in, I think, 400 years. Okay, that even you in Germany, you must have felt it. You had a lot of Russians coming in with money, flashing money, spending money, tipping, and all of that, So that was the result of the good life that Russians started to enjoy. But it wasn't because of Putin. It was because Russia all of a sudden got rich. And Vladimir Putin used that as to sell everyone as his own achievement and enforce this deal that you have a good life. You know, you earn a lot, you open business, we're not going to interfere with you. You are free economically. Travel, invest, save money, earn more, earn high wages, buy cars, buy good food. You know, the future is yours. Just don't ask the question, who rules Russia? Okay? Do not stay put, stay quiet, do not protest. Okay, as long as you're quiet and silent, you enjoy your life. And you see, to Russians, it was very tempting because for decades in the USSR, Russians didn't have a good life, and then in the 90s, things got even worse for a few years, and all of a sudden, literally within a couple of years, this abundance of things. There's lots of money, there's lots of food, cars. Almost everyone could afford car, which is unthinkable in the USSR and in the 90s. So they started enjoying their wonderful lives. And Putin started building his system called the vertical of power. And very interesting point. His system was not strong at first. That's why he stepped down as the president. Okay, because Vladimir Putin, if you remember, he was not the president from 2008 to 2012, and
Talking of
Dmitry Medvedev was, and Dmitry Medvedev was the best president. You know, he eased a lot for Russians. You know, he fired KGB generals, decreased influence of the KGB in Russian society, and he did great things for Russians, lowered taxes for businesses. So I rate him as number one in all presidents Russia has ever had.
but when you look
But
at
he was not
Medvedev,
strong enough. He
yeah,
was not strong enough to continue. Okay, no, he gave in to Putin, and Vladimir Putin, when he came into power, that's when things changed. He started enforcing the deal instead of just selling the deal. Now the economic bloom was off, especially after 2014, because obviously the annexation of Crimea resulted in international sanctions, and Putin, he couldn't sell this wonderful picture of economic prosperity anymore. There was no economic prosperity. Russia was in crisis. And he started enforcing. He started building law enforcement, changing laws. They forbade protests step by step. First, they forbade protesting more than 3 people, then more than 1 person. Later, then they introduced the foreign agent laws and things like that. And the rest is history. So that is the Russian deal. And right now, Russians are forced, just like in the USSR, they're forced to live under this deal. And they start understanding that, and they start feeling it, and that's where we're standing in 2026.
that's what I ask myself all the time. Suffering is the one of the best qualities the Russians have. How long can they stand that anymore? And we are all seeing those 5-kilometer long lines of cars and vehicles. They don't get any gasoline or diesel. Transportation in a vast country as Russia is one of the essential things. The inflation is going up because the Russians don't get any products anymore to their stores, and the companies cannot sell any more products because they cannot transport their stuff. So how long can the Russians stand this any longer? Is there a revolution inside somewhere?
It's a very good question. Difficult to answer, but I'll try. In order to answer the question, you've got to understand where Russia is standing right now. So this is July 4th of 2026. For 4 years, first 4 years of the war, Russia did well economically. For one simple reason. It had a lot of reserves. It had a big savings account to spend. And then Putin tapped into it, and then he was spending like crazy. Russia started earning, historically, Russia always earned more than it spent because of Russian oil and natural gas. A lot of German money went into Russia.
Mm-hmm. And still does.
Yeah, well, not as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so Putin was smart enough to not spend everything, to, or perhaps they just had too much they couldn't spend. That's how rich Russia was. So they were building the reserves. And when they came to the war, 2022, the reserves were enormous. Over $600 billion. Half of it was frozen. It's still in Belgium, 300 million euro.
It's still a lot.
But half of it still remained in Russia, and they started using it. They increased the spendings, military spendings, obviously, greatly. And then they started getting less money. The earnings that Russia was getting from the revenues decreased in 2023. So they were spending more, but and earning less. And the gap was growing. It's called the deficit, federal budget deficit. Right now, it's reached historic high. It's so bad. I personally don't understand how Russians are going to get out of it. Okay, they won't. But anyway, so the money lasted for 4 years, and then it just ran out. I mean, it's simple as that. If you have your savings account and then you keep on taking from it, all of a sudden a day comes when you come to a bank and the banker goes, well, you know what? That's zero, and that's happened. And that was the turning point, 2026. They did a lot of things unwise in the long run. They trying to save their butts in the short run, so to speak. For example, they increased taxes by a great deal for businesses, for corporations, small businesses. They increased value-added tax. The inflation started going up, and Russia economically started sliding down. But then something different happened. Ukrainians found a weak spot of Russian economy, and that is fuel. See, Russia extracts lots of crude oil and exports it, and it still does a great deal. But also it refines a lot of fuel for own demand to satisfy people's needs. So historically, refineries were never a strong point in Russian fuel system. Okay, I know quite well because I used to sell small electric stations to oil refineries. So I used to go to this big meeting industry events of oil refineries, very closed ones. Was really difficult to get there, but I managed, and I know people who used to run refineries. I know how complicated the refineries are, and my company even tried to be a chief designer of a small oil refinery, a new one, in Krasnodarsky Krai back in 2018. The project didn't happen, but I know what it's like on the inside. And first of all, it's a very complicated type of facility, and it requires lots of technologies, foreign technologies. Thousands of what they call licensed processes, okay? And then they come not from Russia, because Russia doesn't have technology to refine high-grade gas and fuel. So Ukrainians started hitting refineries. Mm-hmm. And it started last August, but systematically they started beginning of this spring. And Russians managed to repair refineries from what they use, from what they had in stores, spare parts and equipment before. But then everything has its limit. Just like money, the spare parts, they reached the limit, and the strikes intensified, and they can't repair fast and enough. And then, therefore, Russians got a huge fuel crisis right now. I have not seen anything like this in my life, even though I grew up in the USSR. Never. Right now, it's the most terrible thing that can happen to Russian economy, because this is a catalyst of a free fall. It was already in free fall before, but now it's even worse. Because look, we don't have to be rocket scientists to understand. Fuel is at the base of everything. Especially, you mentioned, you're right on about fuel for Russia is more important than for other countries, because Russia is huge.
Right.
And its railroad system is sparse. It's not developed. So basically, if you want to move something by railroad, you have to, move it to a railroad station far away. Then it goes by rail, and then you load it on trucks and move it someplace. So transportation trucks are involved a lot, and forget about people. People can walk to work. They can take bicycles. The public transportation still runs. That's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the businesses. The food. I mean, there's still food, but it's at the warehouses.
Yeah,
You can't. You need to move it to the stores. Goods, everything, consumer goods. Just about everything. That depends on transportation. And the most scary part for Russia right now is this is July 2nd. This is official start. Yesterday was the official start of the harvest season due to the climate window.
See that.
The farmers have a certain window from July 1st usually to September, depending on what they grow. For wheat, it's July, okay? And they must hurry up and harvest things, okay? Otherwise, there'll be rains, cold weather, and then they're not gonna get stuff. And then right now they're not getting fuel. So my forecast is that things are gonna get much worse for two reasons. First of all, Russians won't get much food into stores. Already we've seen it. Yesterday, trucking companies started notifying food stores, big chains, that they're not going to deliver on time or ever because there's no diesel. And then later, much bigger problem will come as there's not enough food. There will be not enough food. And so coming to your question, that will change Russian mentality because Russians are patient. Yes, I can't say it's a virtue. I think it's their curse, right? They're very obedient and they're very patient, but their patient also always has threshold. And then once the Putin reaches that threshold, things will go uncontrollably. There is a saying in Russia, «Страшен русский бунт, жестокий и беспощадный». It means Russian mutiny is very scary. It's ruthless and bloody, okay? So they wait until the threshold is reached. They go nuts after that. They just destroy everything in their path. That's how it works. And Russia is on the way there. People are getting very angry right now. Yeah, and you got to understand, this fuel crisis, it started happening 2 weeks ago. So it's very fresh. It's the beginning of it. People are they're still patient, okay? They still treat it as, inconvenience, big one, but inconvenience. But you know what? Their anger is growing, and it's growing fast. So we are witnessing a very unique situation right now because this is just the beginning. It's like the Titanic hit the iceberg, and it's the first minutes. You know what I mean? And then this drama is going to unfold in front of our eyes.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, you mentioned that in our first interview, this image with the Titanic. Everybody who hasn't seen this interview, watch it. It's great. It's very interesting what you're describing, Konstantin, here. One moment it will all explode and it bursts out. And that's the great fear of Vladimir Putin because he knows exactly what is coming. That's why he is also having such a big stick in his hand to suppress the people, literally.
The closer to that situation timing is, the more ruthless the Russian authorities will become. The harder they will use the stick because they don't have anything else to use. So the second, you can also watch how the situation in Russia develops by level of violence by the state against people. If it increases, it means that, things are close to explosion.
But people in Russia, they are, from my standpoint of view, they are brainwashed. That's what happened also in our German society under Adolf Hitler. They were brainwashed by the propaganda. And in Hitler times, for the Germans, it was the Jews guilty of everything. And that's why there were people throwing windows of Jewish shops and they were killing Jews. And that was all good for the Germans. So because the Germans were brainwashed, that's what me as a German never understand, how people can just look away. And also now I saw interviews in Russian streets. Obviously, it was Moscow when somebody was interviewing the Russian people what they think about the situation and if they stand behind Putin. And there were quite a lot of people who it was. They obviously they are very convinced that Vladimir Putin is the right guy in the right place. And my fear is, please tell me, Konstantin, what's going on, is are the Russians able to understand that it is because of this war and it was Putin who made the war, who started the war in Ukraine, that all the things are going that bad, or are they still able in this situation now to blame the West and say it's fault of NATO, it's fault of America, it's fault of the collective West, and that's why we are fighting now against the West? Are the Russians seeing, or is the violence just exploding nowhere in whatever direction?
That brings us to another social deal or social contract. That a new contract appeared. Vladimir Putin started selling this new contract to Russian people. At first, the state did not force anyone to accept the war or approve the war. They demanded that Russians just don't pay attention to it. Look away. It's happening far away. Ukraine is not next to, although in Rostov, I was living in Rostov, when the first rockets flew, they flew over me. Wow. Because I'm 40 miles from the border of Ukraine, right? Wow. So, but to Russia is big, right? So to all Russians, it was like, this is far away. Do you even know on the map where Ukraine is? It's not a war, it's special military operation. It doesn't concern you. Live your life. Continue living good life. There's still money. There's still jobs. Now it's even better because Western companies left. So now we have to replace them. Please, move in and replace, provide service. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Siemens, Audi, Mercedes, all everybody left. There's plenty of space for Russian business, thrive. And second thing was like military-industrial complex. Finally, we're getting strong again. Finally, look how many new jobs, and they paying very well, and they did for a while. Go and work at a military factory, 3 shifts, because we need a lot of ammo. We need to defend ourselves from evil Ukraine on their territory. Not. And when I ask, like, how are we defending Russia on their territory, that suddenly shut me down. It's like, whose side are you on? It happened to me quite a few times. But anyway, that was the social deal. Don't look at Ukraine, look away. And again, Russians managed to do that for good, 3.5 years. But then the reality started biting them. Reality always catches up with you, right? So more and more Russians are waking up to the fact and start asking questions, especially those who stand in gas lines. Okay, I have heard and I've seen a number of videos, a number of occasions when people start blaming and threatening Putin publicly in lines, in gas lines. And that I saw that happen when things got very bad in the USSR in the late 80s. People openly started cursing the Communist Party of the USSR. The same thing is happening. So Russia is like, going through the same footsteps. Right now, Russian propaganda is working double time, triple time, selling Russians this idea that it's not Russia's fault. It's the West. Finally, the West is taking hard steps to, destroy Russian fuel industry. So it's all caused by the West. Unfortunately, some Russians still buying it, and some waking up. And it's really hard at this point to say, what is the ratio. But I got to tell you this thing. For many those who still support Putin, at least say they support Putin, the biggest problem and the biggest, obstacle is if you start asking questions, and you always start asking questions yourself first, silently. Okay, that's where it begins. Begins right here and right here. So when you start asking questions, the answers are obvious. Okay, and then you realize that it's not Ukraine is a bad guy. It's not the West, but it's Russia. And why? Not because Russians wanted war. General population, I mean, come on, that no one wanted war, okay? But this group of people who seized control of the country, who has been ruling it for the past 25 years, they decided they need war, they need blood, they need people to die, and it's them. And the worst thing for Russians to accept is that they must realize that it happened with their silent support. They are responsible. It's about personal responsibility. That's why a lot of Russians don't even want to think about it. I have many examples. I speak to people and I ask a question, so I don't know anything about it. Well, I know. I'm an expert. I can tell you. I can enlighten you. No, please don't. I don't want to speak about that because I would go crazy if I learn the truth, if I start thinking about this stuff. That's how they acted. They're still acting, unfortunately. And this is what the biggest problem. So once they start breaking what's inside of them, thinking, once you realize what's happened, you have to take responsibility. And I think that happened to many Germans.
Absolutely.
Once they realized what happened to the Jews, the Holocaust, they felt responsibility and guilt, and that's a very bad feeling. It's hurt. It hurts. I know this feeling. I had it on 24th of February of 2022. It still hurts, not as much because you get used to everything, but that it's still acute pain. It's PTSD. It drives you crazy. Okay, and I think that's the reason why they are not. They're not publicly, openly saying, "All right, this is Putin's fault, and we have to take." That's because they try to avoid this feeling of pain inside in their hearts.
That is very good how you described it, and accurate with this looking away, this cognitive dissonance. It's the psychology names it like that. Putting the head in the sand like an ostrich. That don't bother me. I saw that also many times, also in Germany, without any problems. Obviously, people don't want to know it, and that's why they look away. That's a phenomenon. It's not only Russian. I think it's human. Many people have that, but the problem is really that those lies, they cannot persist. Something happened here. The lies, anyway, I wanted to say the lies cannot persist, and one day the truth comes out. And just take this quote. No, I want to say Russians, the Russian empire is built on lies and on fear. Can you agree to this quote?
Yes, and expansion. Because as any empire, it needs to expand. That's how it can sustain itself, through expanding. Lies, yes, I can agree with that, and fear, of course. They kept Russian people in fear, pretty much always in the USSR, and there was a brief moment in Russian history in the beginning of the 20th century when Russia broke free, basically, and 90s.
Probably also
the 90s were free.
Yes, but also let's perhaps mention the period after Stalin when Khrushchev came into power. Was this also a moment of truth which came into the Russian? No, not really. The Soviet Union.
Well, it was called warming. So people were given some freedoms, okay, but the basic freedoms, for example, freedom to leave the country, oh no, that doesn't happen. The freedom to own property, no. The freedom to open a company and do business, sell things, no. So it was getting a little better. It was warming.
Okay.
Потепление. That's how it's called. But it didn't last for long.
So, but the 90s, that was a good period, but it was also a very brutal period because the criminals took over, and that's why we had all those oligarchs who emerged. But I wanted to say, if you build an empire or on fear and lie, this cannot persist for long. And you mentioned in your last stream, it built on sand. That took me to this quote from the Bible, which I also would like to make, from Matthew 7, verse 26, when Jesus says, an empire, no, if your house is built on sand, this will collapse. Then the winds will come, and the storm and the waters and everything will collapse. So build your house on solid rock. And so I compare the lies and the truth. Truth is a solid rock, and lies are sand. So the Russian Empire must one day for sure collapse. Can you agree?
Well, it's collapsing right now. We are seeing this incredible moment in history of Russia collapsing in front of our eyes. This moment was a previous moment was, I believe it was 1990, late 1990, 91, and right now it's 2026. It might last into 27. I don't know. It might collapse completely in 26, but we are witnessing it. Okay, and then we don't need proof. It's look at the lines that Russians are waiting to pump gas. Look at some stores. More and more appear in Russia with, well, they still have some food, but some things they're out of. Okay, that's the collapse in my eyes. So yes, and then also, not just on country empires are built on lies, yeah, but also built on fear and on usurpation. Because if you want to build a normal country, it's got to build on truth and freedom. That's very important also.
So the Russian suppression machine, I think it's about them. When Putin cannot rely on his army anymore and not on his police, on his secret police, then he should be done. That's how you see it.
I see it that there are forces in Russia, political forces besides Putin. And Putin's genius is in balancing those forces, making sure that none of them grows too strong. Okay, and then making them clash with each other, and then helping one force, one group, then another group. And then he's been balancing them since 2025. Because what is Putin? He's a weak guy. He's just one person, but he's the judge, so to speak, for these groups. Okay, they are under him, and they rely on him for their existence, because he controls the special services. That's also a group. So I see it as that at one point, control will slip from his hands, and he won't be able to control them. Perhaps this moment has already come. I'm not sure. We're seeing it developing. There are more and more signals. For example, Elvira Nabiulina, the head of the central bank, revolted against Putin silently, but revolted. Okay, and then the revolt is in the making. There was a very strong message from a soldier to Putin. He threatened and gave Putin ultimatum to see him in the Kremlin and televise it live, and he claimed there are military forces behind him. This man was taken seriously. He was invited to the Kremlin, and on the way they arrested him for 11 days. And what's happening right now, it's still in the making. It's unclear. Okay, there will be consequences for Putin or not. But you see, these things didn't happen before. And obviously Putin doesn't have money. He used to solve problems with money. If someone needed to be appeased, he would give money to his company because there's each group has a huge business base, behind it. Large corporations, oil companies, and so forth. It's a symbiosis of business and power in Russia, because in Russia, power is about money. In the West, money buys power, and in Russia, power makes money. So Putin, sooner or later, will run into the situation where one of us will become unstoppable. And perhaps this has already happened. The KGB, Siloviki, they are controlling everything pretty much. And the only force that can counter them is the army. So I believe that they will come when Putin will feel unwell and, something will happen to him, heart attack or something like that. Because, it's he's not going to fly out of the window, but let's say heart stopped beating. How is this? Like heart failure. Okay, that happens in Russia all the time. Might happen to him too. And it'll come from his bodyguards. Or somebody will knock on his door, and someone close to him, closest, say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, it's time for you to listen to us. We're going to tell you what you say, and you do it. And you say it. Otherwise, who knows what might happen to you. And that's the second scenario. So he'll be a marionette in their hands. We were waiting for that to happen. So we'll see. We'll see soon. That's how I see the situation.
It's good to hear. But I see it also when Putin is gone, the war will be over. So let's hope and pray that this will soon happen, because it's really incredible for the Ukrainians. But also we in the West, we are so afraid. I have the impression that so many people and governments, politicians, especially as our German ones here, we try everything to support Putin, to keep him, to stay in power, because then Russia is stable. And that's why we have to do everything to prevent it from collapsing.
And what if it collapses? What if it's not stable?
Yeah.
What's then? What would be to Germany?
I know very well, but tell this, please, our politicians. They are so afraid. That's why we are making this broadcast here. Konstantin, I see our time is kind of running out, but I would like to ask you in the end also, you don't do interviews, but perhaps you also have a question on me, especially being a German.
Thank you. I have prepared a couple questions, and the first one is, as a German, when did you personally realize that Russia was not just Putin's problem, but the systematic, the imperial problem, bigger problem?
I realized this from the very beginning of the Ukrainian invasion, the Russian invasion into Ukraine in 2014, but also even before. And I was prepared by my own father. My father, he's passed away since many years now, but he grew up in East Germany, and after the Second World War, he fled from East to West Germany, because East Germany was just a Russian colony. And he had all the time a very harsh focus on the Russians, and I didn't understand this as a boy. And he told me a lot of things, and he was reading books like from Alexander Solzhenitsyn about the archipel Gulag, and so all those stories, which I didn't take for very serious when I was a boy. Yeah, Daddy, you are. But now I see everything is happening, and I realize that my father was true, and that is also kind of my task to confirm this. And when you dig deeper, you see literature of a lot of people who confirm this. Not only literature, also people like you, Konstantin, or take Garry Kasparov or Anne Applebaum. Many people have. We just have to dig deeper, and Russia is a threat. I don't say they will never stop being a threat, but it's way more difficult than it has been for us Germans. We had only 14...
I would say that they will stop being a threat. They will. Once the system is over, and just Russians at some point will have realized that, will have to realize that, they if they want to have normal lives, then...
But this mind virus is in the heads. It has to get out first.
All viruses die.
Yeah,
You know, they run their course.
right.
How long it takes, no one knows. But I believe that sooner or later Russia will change.
I know too.
Now, this is a very interesting question. See, for years I heard the opinion from the West, from the USA and other countries, that Russia was using its natural gas as a geopolitical weapon. And Russians always countered with, like, no, of course not. Of course not. This is a market. You know, this is business. We supply cheap gas to Europe, and everyone is envious. They want to replace our gas. For example, Americans want to replace it with their liquefied natural gas. So it's business. But then it turned out it's not. It wasn't a business after all. So do Germans understand that cheap Russian energy was not just an economic relationship, but political dependency and geopolitical weapon for Russia?
This is a very good question, and I can tell you that maybe a third of the German population has understood it right in the very beginning. About a third of the population understood it now after the full-scale invasion, and they agree, yeah, it's a geopolitical weapon. And a third of the German population still doesn't understand it. You have the AfD voters and the large chunks of the East German population, and they vote for this Alternative für Deutschland party, which is a completely pro-Russian party, which I cannot understand that a thing like this exists in Germany. And they still say it is good to buy Russian, and so they don't understand it. Make it short.
So a third, they don't understand. Although it was Putin who announced publicly that he was shutting gas off for Germany on August, I believe it was August 4th of 2022.
Yeah.
It was Russia. They made this decision and they stopped supplying gas. And then the blow-ups of the pipelines followed later. But it was Russia who decided to stop supplying gas to force Germany and Europeans to, out of fear of cold winter, you know, to stop supporting Ukraine. And they started advertising that. On Russian TV, they started playing this commercial showing that the Europeans are freezing and the Russians are burning gas and, you know, it's all warm. And then they started singing, you know, there's going to be very long and cold winter. Well, so even then, a third of Germans don't understand. That's amazing.
It's amazing. It has to do, I think, with the fear of German media harshly saying the truth, and the politicians, of course. They still say President Putin. They don't call him the Russian dictator. It's still President Putin, and they say the blowing up of this Nord Stream pipeline was a geopolitical. It was a critical infrastructure, and they are speaking of our critical infrastructure, and it was an attack on our critical infrastructure. So this wording tells me that they have not they don't understand that it's better to get rid of the bottle of alcohol when you are an alcoholic, throw it away, pour the alcohol out in the sink and destroy the alcohol. No, they don't do this. They want to have it back. Some parts of the German population still want to have it back. That's a catastrophe too. Putin knows that.
Okay, thank you. Another question, it's kind of a personal one. So when Germans hear Russians say, you know, ordinary people are not responsible, how do Germans react?
I haven't thought about this one. Yeah, maybe also they look away. They don't think too much about this question because on the other hand, they also should say then we are also responsible. So the German.
That's why I'm asking the question. It's a hard one.
That's really a hard one, but I think it's the same phenomenon we had also discussed about the Russian people and about that we Germans had this in our Nazi period, but nowadays we have it too here as Germans, and that's why it's very important to speak the truth. And I can tell you, also many Germans look away and they don't care about this. Yeah, kind of answered your
Okay.
question.
Yes, you answered. Thank you. The next question is, what is the strongest pro-Russian argument still circulating in Germany?
The strongest pro-Russian argument is that Russia is so big and invincible, and it's just impossible to beat a country like that. And then when I answer, look at the Ukrainians, what they're doing. Since 5 years, they prove that it's not true. Yeah, the Ukrainians, yeah, let's freeze the conflict and let's stop the killing and people, yeah.
Okay, let's freeze the. I love it. It's a good answer. Let's freeze the conflict.
This is stupid.
Are Russians freezing the conflict?
Oh, of course not. You look back at the years 2014, 15, when they made the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements. That was our Chancellor Angela Merkel, who is still nowadays proud of having been such a good negotiator and bringing all to the table. And when you hear the German media, you also all the time hear in the main argument is bringing them down to the negotiation table. When will the negotiations start? That is one of the main arguments in Germany. And that is not
Why is this not starting? Is this one question? Why, Ukrainians are ready to negotiate at any time, so who doesn't want to negotiate?
Yes, that's what experts in the television all the time tell, that Putin is not willing. But imagine one day Putin is willing to negotiate, that he says, now I'm standing with the back on the wall, I cannot otherwise, let's freeze the conflict. He will never say that, you mean?
He's not going to do that. No. He will, he's been trying to find a way out, because to him, freezing the conflict when stopping the war is actually death. He's going to be out of the office very soon and he's going to be dead. That's people fail to understand. Putin will not stop because that's existential war for him personally. Okay, that's all. Otherwise, Russia could stop this war in one day by pulling the troops back to Russia. That's a good stop of the war, right?
That's easy.
And it's easy, yes, and there's no need to negotiate. So, Putin, for the past, let's say, couple months, he has increased rhetoric. He publicly admits there will be no stop of the war. At St. Petersburg Economic Forum, I mean, that speech is public out there. Everyone can listen to it. He said there will be no stop of the war. Recently, he said there will be no stop of the war. And all these economic problems will not deter Russia from the war. You know, we will prevail. We're doing fine. We're winning. That's what he's selling Russians right now. Although his domestic front is collapsing, economy is collapsing. So I think the end is near. Not the end of the war, but I shouldn't say the end, but the change, big change. But anyway, we started discussing that. So I have one more question.
Please.
What does Germany fear more? Russian escalation, Ukrainian defeat, or German economic decline?
That's a very good one again. Of course, German economic decline is what we are facing right now. Russian defeat, I think they are really fearing the most the Russian defeat. They are so afraid of a nuclear war, which is coming then. And then when Putin is standing with the back on the wall, then he will throw an atomic bomb when there is no other solution for him. And many experts say this is nonsense. He will never throw an atomic bomb. Okay, we cannot say this, but that's the biggest fear of Germans, I'm sure.
I think the fear should be different.
Tell me. Tell us.
I'm not so sure about the nuclear bomb. Okay,
Mm.
first of all, if nuclear, well, it would be a suicide for Putin. He knows that.
Yeah.
If he
One day
gives
he
an
has to
order, and
die.
that's actually, well, there's always a chance. Okay, Putin is, as I said before, he's genius in finding ways. He's got himself out of many, many situations in the past 25 years. And,
Yeah.
as long as he lives, there's still hope and chance for him. So I doubt he would, uh, you know, use nuclear weapons. I mean, everything is possible, but I think the chances are small. But what Germans should be afraid of, what's going to follow, and that will happen. And it's not a matter of, oh, it might happen or not. It will happen. Now, there are a million Russian men at the front. They're armed and they're getting combat experience. They're getting their minds worked out. Okay. A lot of them are prisoners, former prisoners. And a lot of them were serving time for horrible crimes, murders, rapes, and things like that. And they're going to come back. Some of them are going to come back sooner or later. And a crime wave like Russia has never seen will consume it. It started happening already. In the city where I was born and grew up in Rostov, there are two gangs, very young gangs. They just were formed not too long ago. They both formed by two people. One, they came back from the war as one adult, and then he gets teenagers around, and they go and start extort money from local school, and then the parents complain, say, hey, this thugs come and extort and threaten our kids, in senior in high school, and the cops don't respond. They say, well, you know what, it's not our problem. What do you mean? Well, we have different goals. That's your problem. We're not going to do anything about it, basically. That is reality. It's happening in Rostov-on-Don, and the gang has a name. It's called Talerski. Okay, you can double check it. And that is just the early birds. Just like there's always first line for gas, same thing. Talerski is a very troubling signal for Russia. That's going to spread like fire. Just like what we saw in 1989 when the state started becoming weaker and people started organizing and, basically into gangs. But now, back then, there was no weapons. Right now, weapons are easily available in the black market in Russia because there's the war going on. Back then, no one had combat experience. It was usually, athletes, tough guys, boxers, people who taught physical education at school. They were the strong men, I would say. But now it's completely different. It's those come back from war. And a lot of them will look for jobs and they won't find them. Okay, and then that would be very limited options, and that option of joining someone or getting your own gang would look very attractive. Okay, and with PTSD coming back, they won't hesitate to use guns to harm people, and I think this is a huge problem for Russia, and that's gonna spill over to Europe as well and to Germany. Remember Russian mafia? You had it.
We have a lot of them.
Multiply that by 10. That's what's coming to Germany and to every country, not just Germany, because Russia is going to be exporting mafia. There's so much of it will be in Russia. There won't be enough space for it inside the country. And I think the Germans should be much, much more afraid of that.
So we
And
need
frankly, I don't know what can be done about that. This is a natural flow of things.
so we need really a victory of Ukraine is needed, and a defeat of Russia is needed so that they can build up new structures, and then we, the West, could also think about our mistakes and build up a good security structure, democratic one. And it's going to be very interesting next week when the NATO summit is coming, and I'm going to speak with a military expert, Nico Lange, on this, perhaps also in English language. Let's try. I can speak with him in both languages, in English and German, and so this will be very interesting. But again, we need a Ukrainian victory, a victory of democracy and freedom and truth and justice. Let's wrap it up like this, Konstantin.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Konstantin, that you had time
Christoph.
today for me.
Thank you.
And our audience. And please also don't forget to subscribe to our channels if you haven't done so yet. It's linked down below, everything. Take care. God bless you, dear Konstantin, and be protected.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
You too.